So we're here today to talk to you about the PSTI legislation, which is coming in next year, go over kind of how we got to this position and talk to you a bit more about enforcement. So over the last few weeks, we have been doing a number of engagement sessions with key stakeholders to talk about the journey through to legislation, what's to be expected, and what information we'll be sharing to kind of offer practical support to some of our stakeholders. So on this next slide, we kind of want to start with kind of where we are now. So we know with a number of our stakeholders, some people have had lots of exposure to the PSTI work and have been engaged throughout. Some are just coming at it new or are not sure how and if it applies to them. So hopefully we can share some information on that today. So the PSTI regulations 2023 will come into effect on the 29th of April 2024. So the PSTI Act itself received royal assent in December 2023, and the regulations passed through legislation or passed into law in September of this year. So here we can see the 3 security requirements that are going to be mandated. So but the aim of this work is to increase the minimum level of cybersecurity, for consumer connectable products in the UK made available to consumers. So our ultimate aim is to increase the cybersecurity of products and reduce the number of vulnerabilities and vulnerable products in the market. So on this slide here, I just wanted to talk you through the PSTI Act itself and the regulations. So in the first box there, we wanted to share what you can expect to find within the Act and where to look for information. So the Act itself tells you the scope of the legislation. It provides definitions of who is covered within the legislation, who the legislation applies to. It talks about what is covered in the legislation in terms of the products that the Act and the regulations apply to. Provides the obligations on the statement of compliance, duties for the manufacturers, the importers and the distributors within the supply chain, and also the enforcement powers that my colleague Michael will talk to you a bit more about later on. Alongside that, the Act itself includes delegated powers that we can use secondary legislation to make into law. So that's included in the second box here. So this has got more detail on the product scope and exceptions. So there are a number of products which are not covered under the PSTI Act or regulations for a number of reasons. Either they are already covered under existing legislation or they will be, as we didn't want to kind of double legislate, and we'll go over those in one of the slides. We've also provided further information on the security requirements themselves. So it goes into further detail on those top 3 security requirements: the banning of default or easily guessable passwords, the vulnerability disclosure policy, and also the minimum length of time that security updates will be provided for. So here it's got detailed information on the security requirements and also reference to the ETSC standards. We also provide a list of details that need to be included in the statement of compliance. We know that people are really interested to understand what documentation they need to produce and what they need to provide. And Schedule 4 within the regulations provides a list of information that needs to be included. Lastly, we've got some information on the retention period. So this is how long the statement of compliance needs to be retained for by participants within the supply chain. So this slide here talks about who is covered by the legislation. What we've done here, and hopefully you will get a copy of this or be able to take this away for reference, is kind of share which clauses all these pieces of information are in. We know that people are kind of asking questions in terms of, am I in scope? Is my product in scope? Hopefully these clauses will help provide a little bit more information on where you can go for further detail. So the relevant persons within the legislation are the manufacturer, the importer and the distributor. Alongside that, there are some obligations that will fall on the authorised representative, and that kind of depends on the relationship between the manufacturer and any representative that they have. So the manufacturer, importers and distributors, they have particular duties that apply to them, and they can be found in Chapter 2 of the Act, where it talks about the duties of the relevant persons. The rest of it I'll just leave on there for you to read, but hopefully that gives an idea of who is covered. So talking more about the duties, the aim of the duties is to provide clarity to industry, ensure that the security requirements are applied as intended by setting out what action should be taken and when. They're intended to establish a framework of communication in relation to compliance within the supply chain and with the enforcing authority to enable effective enforcement and facilitate increased compliance. Fourthly, to ensure legislation is enforceable by providing a framework so that breaches can result in enforcement action as necessary. And lastly, to align where possible with existing product safety legislation to promote compliance in industry. Some key takeaways in terms of what the legislation or what the duties do apply to and where they don't apply. So it applies to the manufacturers, the authorised representatives, importers and distributors. It requires them to comply to the security requirements. It refers to relevant products being made available to consumers in the UK if there's a compliance failure. Requires compliance failures to be remedied and enables effective enforcement. So this applies to every participant in the supply chain, as I mentioned. The duties do not apply to individuals acting outside of their course of business. Doesn't apply to used products, so kind of products that have already been made available to consumers or second-hand products. They won't fall under the scope. And it doesn't prevent relevant persons from producing or importing or being in possession of non-compliant products. So businesses may have products that they're in possession of, that they're making available to other markets. They will not fall in the scope. So this very colourful slide here tells you kind of the obligations for each kind of relevant person within the supply chain. So there are duties for mainly manufacturers to comply with the security requirements, additional duties that fall on importers, and also distributors. So for the statement of compliance, the manufacturer will need to produce the statement of compliance to evidence that they have complied with the 3 security requirements. This statement of compliance must accompany the product when it goes on to the next kind of person in the supply chain to kind of evidence and assure that the requirements within the PSTI Act and regulations have been met. And that kind of follows on through the supply chain. So the distributor will also need to have access to the statement of compliance in order to sell that product to UK consumers. There are duties to investigate where there's been a potential compliance failure and duty to take action where a compliance failure has taken place. As you can see, that kind of follows on through all the participants within the supply chain. And then lastly, there is a duty to maintain records. So hopefully this will provide like a helpful guide to kind of pinpoint manufacturers, importers and distributors to know where to look for further information to understand what obligations apply to each kind of individual organisation and where they can look for further information. So here we want to talk a little bit about the products that are in scope. So these are connectable products. There's definitions within the legislation. So these are products that are either internet connectable products or network connectable products. We've got some examples of products on the screen. So these are just examples. We don't have lists to say these products are in scope and these products aren't. They have to kind of meet the requirements within the legislation. But products that connect to the internet either through an internet connected protocol or a network connectable and are sold to UK consumers will be in scope unless they've been exempted. So within Schedule 3 of the PSTI regulations, we've talked about product vertices that will not be in scope of the legislation. So we've talked about products being made available to be supplied in Northern Ireland. These products will be accepted if legislation in Annex 2 of the Windsor framework with the relevant kind of if the relevant free movement article applies to it. So charge points for electric vehicles will be exempted, medical devices are exempted, and smart meter products. Lastly, we haven't included computers, laptops, and tablets without a cellular connection as an outcome of our kind of call for views back in 2021. so they're not included at this point. So this next couple of slides has a few resources in. So what we really wanted to kind of share with you today is some practical information that you could use going forwards. So we wanted to highlight these 3 really useful and informative guides produced by IoTSF. So there's short guides, quick links, webinars for each of the 3 security requirements. And then the existing information that we have and the existing resources are the legislation and links to the PSTI Act, the PSTI regulations. We also want to make sure people are aware of the ETSC standards and all the supporting information. I'm sure many of you here in the room are aware that we are hearing that there are many manufacturers, importers and distributors who aren't aware, so please do share with your networks. In terms of resources that we are looking to provide, OPSS will be providing a landing page where organisations can kind of find all the relevant information. There'll be some enforcement guidance that is produced, and we will also be sharing some non-statutory policy guidance. So whilst it won't go into kind of bespoke case-by-case responses in detail, it will give an overview of where people can look for information and kind of help guide people through the process. Lastly, there's some supporting information on the gov.uk pages and explanatory memorandums. So I think that's kind of an overview of where we are now. If there's any further questions, we're happy to be contacted. So there's quite a lot to talk about in terms of the legislation. We haven't gone through it all today, but happy to take questions. And I'll pass it over to Michael.
So moving on, just going to give a bit of an overview of the Office for Product Safety and Standards, who we are and how we work. And yes, we're the Secretary of State's chosen enforcing authority for the PSTI. A bit of background here. OPSS is the UK's product regulator and was set up in 2018, but prior to that we've had a number of different guises enforcing other pieces of legislation. So whilst we're not that old, we are quite a mature regulator. OPSS is the national regulator of most consumer products as well as construction products. I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And we hold policy responsibility for product safety, legal metrology, standards and accreditation, hallmarking, market surveillance and primary authority. There's 2 really important things in there. The first is legal metrology. We have to make sure that a pint is a pint. And then secondly, market surveillance. So we are responsible for the coordination of market surveillance across the UK. So that's not just about me as a market surveillance authority in terms of what we enforce, but it's making sure that we liaise with the likes of Ofcom and Ofgem. So we enforce regulations across the product life cycle, from design, manufacture and assessment through to supply, end use and safe disposal. So we now sit within the Department for Business and Trade. I don't have any business cards because we're constantly changing titles, whether it be our organisation or the department that I'm in. But that means that we've got various contacts across the globe with priorities which include that we ensure the UK is a great place to invest and to innovate, which is really important with this piece of legislation. And part of that is one of our OPSS aims, which is to be a trusted regulator. We hold a number of responsibilities across the product life cycle. So they're listed here. The top 2 paragraphs are probably the most important in terms of we're the national regulator for product safety for consumer goods, except for vehicles, medicines and food. We're also the product regulator for legal metrology. So legal metrology and product safety we do in combination with local authority trading standards. Construction products, we work as part of a joint office with the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. I'm glad I remembered that. And we also have responsibility for primary authority, which is where businesses can coordinate with their local authorities to get assured advice about local regulatory matters and cover the whole of the UK. We're also the UK government's enforcing authority, or market surveillance authority, for a range of goods-based and standards-based regulations, which include PSTI, other things which some people in the room might recognise. So we've got ROS in there as well, the restriction of certain hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment. Eco-design and energy labelling, batteries and end-of-life vehicles. And then we also have the lead on a range of technical and environmental regulations, and down there is electric vehicle charge points, which means that some other parts of the ETSC are within our remit as well. And what this means is that we envisage being the one regulator for business where possible, so that when our staff visit you and have a chat with you, they will be able to either talk to you about other areas of legislation that we cover or point you in the right direction. And the broad knowledge of these areas gives us insight into supply chains, as well as understanding the importance of adherence to the relevant regulations from inception through to production, through to being in people's houses. And that is kind of hopefully to reassure businesses that we understand the process involved and we understand what regulation means. It's as important to us to understand the requirements as it is to you, and for us to agree on the ways forward. This is our approach in a couple of probably oversimplified pictures. The top picture is how we work in terms of identifying non-compliance, which varies per piece of legislation in relation to the various powers and sanctions that we have. The PSTI bill and the subsequent regulation gives us useful tools to achieve the policy goals, which align to OPSS priorities, specifically to protect people and places. Our operational plan will determine the ratios of the three topics listed there. There's a lot of business engagement going on now in order to ensure that businesses know who the regulator is and that we can be an open door for people to talk to us and look for advice. We'll be looking at testing, and we'll be looking at desk-based inspections as well, and that will mature over the course of time. Input into these activities will come from our own intelligence, as well as information from businesses, security researchers, and then that will determine the priority products, sectors, and it will create risk profiles for us. Should we identify non-compliance? This is probably the bit that you were waiting for. We will work with businesses to identify where they sit on the arrow at the bottom. So we'll work on a case-by-case basis to achieve compliance in a proportionate, pragmatic manner. We want businesses to understand and move across from left to right on here, ultimately using sanctions sparingly. So in terms of what we're doing now, we're setting up the team in preparation of the regs coming into force next year. And this involves work on risk, intelligence, guidance, and we're prioritising stakeholder engagement at the moment because, as I say, understanding business concerns, their approaches to compliance, and any challenges in achieving compliance are invaluable in approaching enforcement. And this will really contribute to those conversations once the legislation comes into force next year. I'm going to press the next slide. And there we go. Thank you very much for listening.